Um, in class on Lovecraft today. Did everyone have a chance to finish it? Yeah, cool. Did anyone take a time to, let me rephrase that. Did anyone take the time to reread it for those who had already finished it? No, that's fine. Okay, so last week we covered one reading of Lovecraft, right? So, as the title of that class had indicated, we focus more on what we refer to as reader response theory, right? So how a text makes you feel, right, based off of the phenomena that it's trying to understand, right, and how Lovecraft in that text does a kind of interesting thing, right? That's kind of the heart of what we got at last week was how both as a writer himself, he's trying to grasp at these incomprehensible situations. And in the text itself, he kind of frames the narrative as a writer or as the narrator of the narrative, also trying to understand these things, right? So there's this kind of dual response going on in the text. I basically summed up like 2.5 hours of lectures right there, but that's the long and short of it. So before we get into this week's reading of Lovecraft, did anyone have any questions from last week or anything that they were unsure of or that they wanted to bring up? I know a week is long in people's minds. I include myself in that, but just in general. We're good? All right. So one of the things I wanted to start off, wow, great, off to a wonderful start with this. Why is this happening? It's fine. Well, off to a strong start. Everything's plugged in. Any tech geniuses here? Nope. That's why we're in English literature, I guess. Okay. Let's turn this off and try to reboot it. Turn it off. Yeah, turn it off and turn it back on again. Okay. Yeah, we just repeat it. Okay, so while this is apparently just closing down, basically what we're going to be covering today is kind of the flip side of what we covered last week, right? So last week we focused in a way on the macro, right? An overview of how we respond to a text, right? As we talked about, reader response theory relies a lot on some of our communal understandings of certain situations, right? What kind of communities we're in, how we respond to certain ideas, and so on. Whereas what we're going to be focusing on this week is what we refer to as structuralism, right? As is implied in the actual title of this week's class, right? A structural chaos. So just based off of this, right, just based off the name, we'll start there like we started last week. What's implied in a term like structuralism, right? Yes, Adam?
A sort of skeleton to the text.
Okay, a skeleton to the text. Do you want to say more about that? What do you mean by skeleton?
Following a sort of format. Trying to use a different word than structure. Alright, and like we have like I guess we could use the basic format.
Mm-hmm.
And we have the starting action, and then we have the development, and the climax, and the following action, and then the end.
Right. So that's absolutely one way of, okay, well, apparently this works. But as soon as I exit see, for some reason it doesn't work as soon as I exit. Okay, so I guess I'll just stay on the PowerPoint the entire time and not show you the examples that I have. Okay. Well, we'll just make do with what we have. But yes, all that to say, that is definitely one side of structuralism, right? It's implied right there in the title, right? We're looking at the form of something or some kind of skeleton, right? But it can go even further than that. Let's push that even further. What else can we think of if we think structuralism? What's part of the structure of a text, right? What elements do we look at if we're looking at the structure? Is it simply beginning, middle, and end? It can be, right? That is one element. Yeah.
It could start in the middle.
Okay, it could start in the middle. Then isn't that just a beginning?
Not necessarily, because we could go back to the beginning afterwards.
Right. So, how we actually play with that structure, right? Like generally in Western literary traditions, a lot of stories have a similar structure to them, right? If ever you want a good example of how conventional literary structure works, or conventional narrative structure, so to speak, the best example is in Star Wars, right? The first one, I mean, the old ass one from like 1977.
That's good.
It's pretty good. But like structurally speaking, right? Even the writer of that movie, George Lucas, has definitively stated that like he relied on structuralist understandings of narrative in order to build that movie, right? So if you want a good example of how conventional story structure works in a lot of people's minds, that's a really good one, right? Hero starts off in one place, meets a wise old man, in this case, Obi-Wan, right? Who sends him on a journey, right? At first he refuses that journey, but then accepts it. In this case, Luke accepts it because his aunt and uncle died, right? They were burned to a crisp in the desert. And so that convinces him to go on his journey, right? And then the whole story is the story of that journey, right? And at the very end, right, of that journey, you come back to where you started, so to speak, having been a little bit changed, right? Just a little bit. You're changed by the experiences, right? So you can never quite go home. Okay? So that's one way of looking at it. What other elements can we look at? Think even more micro, right? So we have the structure, beginning, middle, and end. What else? If we dig even deeper, what other types of structures do we see? Yes, remind me your name. Oh, yeah. Genres, good, excellent, right? There's certain expectations about genres that we have, right? If you pick up a fantasy novel at Indigo, right, you don't expect flying spaceships, right, in that fantasy novel, because it doesn't fit within our idea of what goes into a specific genre. Right? And the list can go on. Yes, Minli. Say more. Yes.
Vibe.
Yes, the vibe of the story, right? So yeah, what makes the vibe of the story the vibe itself, right? Like, how do we qualify that? Yeah. Do you have your hand up, Adam? Yeah. You can either answer or someone else, but how do we get to understand the vibe of the story? We kind of started talking about that with Poe, but we never really went in depth into it. There's a reason why. It's because we're going to talk about it today. Yeah.
Probably part of it would be the specific description, but like the over description. What's the word?
So the description absolutely can be a part of it, right? We spent some time with that on Poe, right? His usage of words, right, was very specific. And Francesca, you alluded to that last week in relation to Lovecraft, right? His use of words came out to you. And I told you to hang on to that because this is what we're going to get to today, right? But you're absolutely right. And all of this kind of comes together, right? This idea of genre, story structure, the vibe, comes together into one question that I'm going to come back to at the very end. What specifically makes Lovecraft weird fiction, right? In a literal genre sense. Right? A lot of literary critics see weird fiction as its own genre now, right? So bringing the elements that we're going to be talking about today, right, and those that we maybe talked about last week in relation to Lovecraft, why do we consider this weird fiction and something like Gilman and Poe, which do have some elements in common, something closer to Gothic, right? What are the genre implications of something like weird fiction? What are the narrative implications of something like weird fiction? What are the textual and linguistic implications of something like this? Right? It took us 4 weeks to get there, but we're finally there. Okay, we're finally actually asking this question. Maybe that's just me who put too much setup into this whole thing, but we finally got there. So all that to come to the idea that right, where last week we spoke about reader response as like an individual trying to understand the wider world around them, right? So going from the micro to the macro, if you want to use those terms. Structuralism, like I said before, is the opposite, right? We want to understand the structures, the genres, the big stuff, right? The macro aspects of story and how they influence or how they change and demand, according to some people, right, that stories are written in the way that they are, right? Going from the macro to the micro of the story. Okay? Does that make sense to everyone so far? Yes? Okay. So, surprising perhaps few of you here, whenever we talk about a structuralist reading, that started in the early 20th century with the work of a linguist, right? Called Ferdinand de Saussure. Has anyone ever heard of that name before? Maybe. Saussure. Saussure. No, Ferdinand Saussure. He actually published very little in his lifetime. And a lot of the ideas of structuralism that would grow out of him were actually published after he died. So he gave a lecture in the early 20th century on linguistics, and he actually never made that lecture into a book. What happened was that his students took their collective notes about those lectures and then made it into a book after he died, right? So already there's kind of like a removal from Ferdinand Saussure's original work. But the long and short of those lecture series was that he took linguistics, right, and basically examined their underlying language structure, right? It was like, what makes language the way that it is, right? That was his basic question, right? And there's a lot to unpack in Saussure, so I'm just going to focus on a few things, of course. I'm not going to sum up the entire lecture series because we're going to be here forever. But in essence, right, his ideas were to say that language is a system of difference. Does anyone know what that might mean? Language is a system of difference. Oops. Sorry. Language is a system of difference. Yeah.
Because
Take a shot.
okay, well, language brings people together because it creates creates societal groups and all that. And this is a language of differences, maybe because it allows us to show our differences and to write our differences, talk our differences, which bring us closer together, I guess, because we're not single hive mind, it turns out.
So that's certainly part of it. That's not the way that he intended it in and of itself, but that he definitely implies certain elements like that eventually, right? He'll get there. Anyone else want to take a shot? Yeah. Remind me your name. Mia, go for it. Yeah. Yes, go ahead. It's fine. Mm-hmm.
So your language, you have to study its history.
Good.
And each language's history is different.
Yes.
But it all comes down to kind of the same thing, which is to communicate.
Yes.
So it's like the whole web of differences that are at the end all connected.
Right. How did we end up with 17 different European and Asian languages that all come from what linguists call Indo-European, right? Proto-Indo-European, right? If any of you have studied linguistics, there's this theory of language that there was this kind of like proto-language that if you go back far enough connects basically English, French, German, and even some Indian languages, right, from the Indian subcontinent, right? So it goes back really, really far. And yet we suddenly end up with, over thousands of years, right, we end up with all of these different languages that in and of themselves are very arbitrary, right? And this arbitrariness is really what Saussure is getting at with the idea that language is a system of difference, right? Not only in the senses that you all brought up that we have different words for different things, right? Even despite any kind of origin that is the same, but also there's a system of difference in the way that we actually understand a word, right? So to Saussure, we use a word like cat, and we understand it to be this furry little hellspawn that scratches your sofa because it is not dog, right? We understand things by what they are not, is essentially Saussure's point, right? Now, there's all kinds of ways to go against this, right? Pedagogy and education has kind of done some work on saying that that's not quite how we actually learn and understand things. But the point here is to say that this basic idea, right, that a word is very much an arbitrary sign for something, right? It's essentially a random sign for something else, will basically revolutionize literary thought, right? Because it has all kinds of implications, right? Why do we use this specific word for this specific thing, right? Or to come back to the history point that was brought up, what does a word mean in a particular moment in time? And how does that word change? So what a lot of structuralists would kind of focus on is the difference between sign, right? So the word itself, C-A-T, spelled out on a sheet of paper, cat, and the signifier, right? Which is the actual in life, furball. Right? And how those two kind of enter into dialogue together, right? And that simple idea, so to speak, was quite revolutionary at the time, right? 150 years ago. And it would kick off what we know today as structuralism. Right? But this is something also, just to kind of emphasize the importance that this has, not just in a literary context, but overall. This can have widespread implications for history, politics, society, right? And I'll use one example. Remind me what your name is? What's your name? Great. What do you think of when I say the word terrorist? What comes to mind? Dangerous? Good, right? Aya, what comes to mind when you hear terrorist? Whatever, no one's going to cancel you here. The IDF, okay, good. What's your name with the American flag? Who's drinking water right now? Yeah. What do you think of when you say when you hear terrorist? Terror, yeah, good. Actual fear, yeah, good. So these, right, to a structuralist, these ideas would be an example of how this is a very modern understanding of the word terrorist, right? The IDF is a relatively recent phenomenon in world history, right? And so someone even 100 years ago would not have that same association, right, to the word. Or even less than 100 years ago, right? If we take that same word and ask someone in the 1960s, right, what is a terrorist? They certainly wouldn't answer, right, the IDF, or probably not, right? What they would answer is probably something closer to the IRA, right, the Irish Republican Army, right, or some Latin American independence group, right? Or even the Red Army faction in West Germany, right? Because it was the Cold War. And so that would have probably been at the front of people's minds, right? Go back to the 18th century. What's a terrorist in the 18th century? Does anyone know? Yeah.
Any force that's related to political gains, flags, not human lives.
Good. Except, again, that's a very modern thing. And there's a reason why I chose the 18th century here, because that's where the term originates. Francesca?
Freedom fighters.
Good.
So what would be a terrorist to me is not necessarily a terrorist to somebody else.
Absolutely. So there's already a bit of a slippage, right, between that word, right, and what it actually signifies, right, depending on the context. Yes?
18th century?
Yeah, go.
And Civil War?
Good. Awesome. The Civil War. Not the Civil War. The Revolutionary War. Yeah. Revolutionary War in 1776, right, kicks off. But specifically, there's a revolution that would happen like 10 years later that specifically has the word terror associated to it. What happened like about 20 years after the American Revolutionary War? Another revolution happened, 1790s, late 1780s. Yeah, the French Revolution. Yeah, the famous terror, right? That's where that comes from, by the way, right? Our modern word terrorist comes from the French Revolution, right? Because the people who were against the revolutionaries, right, labeled them as purveyors of terror, right? That's where the term the terror comes from, right? It was people who were afraid of what the French revolutionaries were doing, right? With the guillotine and all of that. And so decided to say they are committing some kind of terror on their population, right? And so they are terrorists, right? So already, so you are technically right, yeah, when you're saying like, oh, it's people who want power, right? But again, at the time when that term first started, it was even more removed than that, right? So this one sign, right, and this is just one example, right, that I thought was kind of interesting, but you can have all kinds of terms to pick from throughout history, right? But this one sign, terrorist, right, has different signifiers, different ideas of what it means throughout history. And none of them are the same, and none of them probably will ever come back, right? They're all contingent on a specific time, a specific place, a specific set of ideas about what politics, society, and community should be. Yes, Aya. Yeah, yeah.
Whereas when I look at Irish history class, they were presented as
exactly right. To take the famous a different group, but Fidel Castro has that famous quote, right? History will absolve me. Right? And that's kind of what happened with the IRA in many ways. They went from terrorists in the 1960s to freedom fighters, to use Francesca's term, right? In part because the Irish at least partially won their bid for independence, right? There's still Northern Ireland, of course, that's a thing, but right, the Irish won, and so history kind of flipped on what the IRA kind of did. Right? So it's a whole thing. And this is a relatively recent phenomenon if we want to keep going on the IRA, right? Like, they existed into the 90s. So it wasn't that long ago in history that people would have had some kind of negative association with the IRA, right? And then, of course, right, 9/11 happened. That was a whole thing. And the term for terrorist changed. I'm kind of surprised that none of you said, right, a terrorist is like a member of Al-Qaeda or something like that, because at least someone from my generation, that's what was drilled in my mind, right? Although maybe there's already like that distance from one generation to another, I'm not sure. But regardless, right, it doesn't really matter here. The point is terms change over time and place. Does that make sense to everyone? Right, cool. Now, you can, if we want to bring it back to the literature, right? Of course, there are plenty of examples that we can pick from where it relates to something like Lovecraft. And I wanted to show you all a really cool example, but the computer is not letting me. So I'll see if I can like actually try to send it to you all on Studio, or something like that, so you can see what I'm talking about. But basically, the example that I was pulling from is from his probably most famous story, The Call of Cthulhu, which some of you might have read or not. But what someone did was take a section of that novel and removed its adjectives and adverbs, right? And so suddenly the meaning really changes, right? Technically, it's the same story, right? This happens and this is what I'm talking about. But even just changing descriptors, right, completely changes, right, the narrative vibe, right, or the genre that we imagine a particular term to be associated with. So yeah, I'll see if I can actually like get that up to you just to give you an example, but sorry, not going to happen. I guess today we're just stuck with this. So this was the original conceit, right, of structuralism. Now, like I said, this happened at the beginning of the 20th century. Where it would enter into literary practice, right, is in the 1950s, much like reader response would, right, which we talked about last week. Who can tell me, right, why people would suddenly be interested in looking at structural ideals, right, in the 1950s, right? It's pretty similar to what we talked about last week, right? Yeah.
Look what you talked about last week. Well, I didn't finish this, but I guess there was a golden age happening there.
Okay.
The baby boom and all that after the Second World War, and right before the Cold War was just starting.
Yep. Cold War just started.
So I think people were like, there was a lot of I think like critical writing at that point.
Mhm.
So I guess people would look into structuralism and all that because of that.
So on the one hand, absolutely, the Cold War starting, which we mentioned, suddenly two superpowers are facing off, right? The United States, the Soviet Union, they're kind of like these two huge powers in the world, and people want to try to understand what makes them tick, right? How can some entity, some nation, have so much influence over everything else, right? Over literally the politics of dozens of countries, right? But also, right, to bring it back to last week, remember, historically speaking, society had just gone through what? 2 world wars, right? Not just one, 2, right? And the first one was apparently not enough for humanity to understand the concept, and so we decided to nuke ourselves, right? In the face of very chaotic situations, right, in which most of Europe was eradicated, right, kind of leveled down to the ground, in which horrible acts of barbarity were committed, suddenly people kind of want to look for a systemic answer to that, right? And understanding the underlying structure of the narratives that we tell ourselves, right? Bringing it back to literature a little bit, right? Is an important way of doing that. Why did the stories that we tell ourselves about how modernity was a good idea, how our nation states have our best interests at heart, right? Those fundamentally failed. A lot of people, millions of people in the early 20s, and people kind of were looking for an answer as to why. Right? This is an idea that we brought up many times in this class. Right? Structuralism was just one way of kind of approaching that. So fundamentally understanding how the stories we tell ourselves are constructed, right, through the examples that I gave, right, of what a sign means versus what it refers to, right, is one way. If we want to think about it even further, obviously there's ways of understanding genres like we were talking about and so on. But on a linguistic level, it goes so far as to people looking at the very grammar of sentences, right? How is a sentence fundamentally structured, right? That changes a lot. Let's take an example. What exactly is the subject of a sentence, right? Actually trying to figure out what's the focus and what's doing the action in a particular sentence may sound like something fundamentally boring, right? And straight out of like a grammar 1 class, right? Find the subject in the sentence. But actually understanding what that subject is in the grammatical sense and why an author made it the subject of the sentence in the first place can really have an impact on how we understand the story. Right? Or what structuralists would also do in many ways is to look at some of the contradictions and oppositions that are in texts. Right? Why is one thing referred to as hot, whereas another thing is referred to as cold? Right? That's just a very easy example here, but these oppositions that are often found in texts can, again, have huge implications. Right? Or even just to take an example that we looked at last week, right? The paintings, right? The paintings that Lovecraft refers to in the text, right? Does anyone remember what adjectives he associates with the Roerich paintings, at least for those that were there? Yeah. Haunting, disturbing, yeah, things like that. There's another big one that will provide a really good example here. It's a capitalized adjective. Starts with an A, A-S. 5-letter words. Let's play, what's it called? That cage.
Hangman.
Oh, hangman. Yeah, sorry.
It's fine.
Asian. Right? That's the term he associates with the paintings. So let's take a quick detour here. Horrible, haunting Asian paintings. We know that Lovecraft was, as we talked about last week, a, raging racist. And, a structuralist would look at this and say, this is not necessarily a coincidence, right? Obviously not, we're not excusing that. Of course, it is by definition racist and therefore horrible. But those associations of terms, right, is not a coincidence for a structuralist reading, right? A structuralist would look at these terms and say, Lovecraft is a professional writer, and he decided to put these terms together in order to create a particular effect, right? And so the very structure of the sentence, the very components of it, have a major influence on what exactly he's trying to convey. In this case, a haunting image that is meant to terrify early 20th century readers, right? And that today we don't necessarily think about because most people are not prejudiced. Well, statistically speaking, most people are not prejudiced. But, you know, the idea being that, again, our senses shift over time. And so knowing this in the context of Lovecraft's time and context does change, right, how we actually perceive a particular story. Okay, now, before we move on to the next part here, does anyone have any questions about structuralist analysis? There's obviously a lot to unpack here, and I'm going to change the slides in a second to look at some key questions that kind of evolve out of structuralist analysis. But the last thing I want to say, right, is that, you know, if we wanted to sum up what I just said and bring it back to what I started the lecture off with, you know, what a structuralist is looking at is not the pretext, right? What's outside of the text. In essence, what a structuralist reader looks at is the subtext, right? If you want to write that down in your notes as like an easy way to understand it, not the pretext, but what's implied in the subtext, right? What's behind the actual word or set of words. Essentially, literature, surprising as it may be, is a code, right? That's what literature is to a structuralist. And the tools at a structuralist's disposal in order to unravel that code are things like grammar, genre, and narrative. So as I did with reader response last week, if you want to put it in concrete terms, these are the kinds of questions that a structuralist would look at, right? And again, I'll be putting this PowerPoint up on Studium, so you know, don't feel that you have to rush through these questions. I see some people already erasing their notes, right? But just to take a few examples here, you know, people like Fry, Northrop Frye, who was actually born in Quebec, by the way, and became one of the most famous structuralist analysts in history, really literary history. He would have a huge influence on literary theory. Someone like Northrop Frye would basically set out a theory of myths, right? Looking at different kinds of myths from across, in this case, the Western canon. And he would look at what makes them fundamentally tick, right? So he would look at things like comedy, right? Or tragedies, right? In the classical Greek sense of comedies and tragedies, and say, okay, what are they composed of? If we break them down into their, you know, constituent parts, what does that mean, right? So for example, in a comedy, he would come to realize that what it is, it's not just funny, right? Because that's too easy. Structurally, a comedy, to Fry at least, is something like a resistance or a subversion, right, of the regular norm, right, quote unquote. And so that's the basis of a comedy for him, right, is when something kind of is flipped on its head. And you can see this in all kinds of classical comedies, right? If we take A Midsummer Night's Dream, right, by Shakespeare, classic comedy, the main premise of this is that there's a bit of a flip going on, right, in society. I'm saying this, and I don't know if any of you have ever read A Midsummer Night's Dream, but that's kind of the basis of it. Have any of you ever read A Midsummer Night's Dream? Okay, great, at least one person. Yay, thank you, Aya. So this is basically one way of looking at it, right? Break down a genre into its most basic parts, right? And see how a text actually fits in or disrupts those constituent parts. But you can even have, let's go to question number 4 here. as a really good example. What are the semiotics of a particular text? Who can tell me what a semiotic or what semiosis is, or semiotics, period? It's a fancy word for a word that we use every day. Yeah. Essentially, a semiotic analysis or a semiotic object, right, is in one way the sign and signifier that I was talking about put together, right? That would be a semiotic aspect. On the more fundamental level, semiotics is also an image or a representation of something, right? The most famous theorist for semiotics, at least in the literary tradition and cultural tradition, is a person by the name of Roland Barthes, who you might have heard of before, at least the name. He had a phenomenal book come out in the 50s called Mythologies, right? And what he did, and this relates to semiotics, is he looked at all kinds of prevalent images in French society at that time. So he has a chapter on wrestling. He has a chapter on magazines, right, that show particular images on the front cover. And he looked and analyzed what those images imply, right? So his most famous one was his examination of a magazine. I forget what the name of the magazine was, but what it had smack on its cover was a little black soldier, right, saluting the French flag. Very evocative image, right? And we have to remember this was at the time when France was slowly starting to lose its colonies, right, to independence movements. And so what he was looking at is how this image demonstrated a lot of the anxieties that French society had about losing its colonies, right? And how this image was trying to reinforce the myth that the colonized subject, in this case a little black boy saluting the French flag, were actually happy and were actually benefiting from French colonization, which is of course the greatest myth of imperialism. Right? It never was true, of course. But what he was saying is that this image is intended to reinforce this idea in the mind of the public. Does this make sense to everyone? Right? How this might operate? Yeah? Ish? Do you have any, you saying yes? Yeah. Yeah, you arrived here after this happened. I will try, that's because it is a really good image, right? So I can't do it justice by simply describing it, right? And for some reason, as soon as I exit the PowerPoint, the entire thing shuts down right now, so I can't actually show you on the screen, because otherwise the whole system is going to crash.
You could copy-paste this onto the PowerPoint.
Copy-paste it onto the PowerPoint. Hold on, let's see if we can actually do that.
Make a slide.
Apologies. Yeah, here we go. Okay, it's not the full image, but it's as close to the image as we're going to get here. Let's see if this works. This is the image he was talking about, right? He spends a whole chapter on it. Right, and yeah, so sorry, there's no French flag in the image, but if I remember correctly, the whole analysis is like, what is the child looking at? And the implication is that he's looking towards, right, the French flag, right, sorry. So, right, and the boy is not, right, scarred or anything like that. He seems like a normal, healthy, even proud boy, right? Which, again, is not at all the reality of what the colonized subject was, right? By definition, they were imposed upon. Right? And so, for that, it's not a coincidence that this image would appear on one of France's most famous and most popular magazines, right? Paris Match. Still around today, although less important than what it once was because it's kind of a tabloid now. Right? But it's not a coincidence for Barthes that this image would appear on the newsstands right as France was losing its colonies. Right? Does that kind of make sense now, what we're talking about? Yeah. Okay. So anyway, all that to say, let's see if I can remove this. There we go. All that to say, right? This would basically be the foundational way of looking at literature going forward, right? There are so many literary theories that would extend from structuralist analysis, and even not literary theories, just regular theories that would adopt a lot of the notions of structuralism. One of them we're going to be talking about next week, right? Psychoanalysis, right, famously started by people like Freud and continued by cultural critic Jacques Lacan, right, is a very structuralist theory at the end of the day, right? It's just looking at a different structure, the structure of the mind, right? How do our brains operate, and how do the images that our brains tell us and send to us when we're sleeping, right, change the way that we operate in life? It's a very structuralist notion, right? We're not going to talk about it until after the break, but Marxist literary theory, right, which is still a major theory despite the kind of slandering of the ideology behind it, is also a very structuralist type of reading at the end of the day, right? It's just looking again at a different kind of structure. It's looking at the structure of economic policies, for example, would be the basis of it, or that of class struggle, right? So all of these, right, would have major influences going forward. Even, today what we imagine to be post-structuralism, which we're probably going to get to at the end of the semester in some way, shape, or form, started off as people who were just expanding on the structuralist project, right? They never intended to go beyond it and to break it down, right? People like Jacques Derrida, who is probably the most famous post-structuralist thinker, would really just kind of expand on the structuralist idea, right? And it kind of went way out of his hands almost immediately. Okay. Does anyone have any questions at all? Right. This is the most clear thing ever. Yeah. So again, I'll just kind of remind you, because I have time here. The reason why I'm doing this, right, why I'm showing you different ways of reading a text, right, is not because I want to confuse you or make this the most nonsense class possible, right? The whole purpose behind my little segments on different literary theories is to create parallels between the development of a particular literature and the way that we read a kind of literature. And this is just ways for you as students of literature to actually think through the texts that you're reading, right? Which is not something I think we tend to do in the university, is to actually tell you how to read a text, right? But the people who teach you, right, the professors and the lecturers like myself, right, these were things that were learned eventually, right? It's not just random what people do when they do literary theory or literary analysis, right? We ask specific types of questions, right, about a text. And you have no obligation to take these questions, right, or do anything. If it's not your vibe, so be it. Right? But I do think they're important to consider, right, nonetheless. Now, if no one has any questions, I sent a message about this, but how many of you actually read notes on the writing of weird fiction? Okay, yeah. So I sent it in the Nouvelle, right, section. I mentioned that it would be really good if you could read it. It's not a very long text. So actually, you probably have time if we take a break in like the 10 minutes to read through it. But the reason why I wanted to highlight this is because I really think it's a good article for connecting both the theory of structuralism, how people see different genres and modes and writing styles, to today's literature. Because Lovecraft himself, who wrote Notes on the Writing of Weird Fiction, kind of gets at the heart of a lot of the structuralist ideas that we're going for today. So what I'll do, it is a little bit earlier than I usually take a break, but I want to allow you to kind of like at least skim through that article if you haven't read it, and think about how it does reflect in many ways some of the ideas that we brought up in this first part of class. Okay? So yeah, take like 10 minutes or so. So come back at 1:35 more or less, And we'll talk about this article in relation to structuralism and then move into At the Mountains of Madness for the rest of the class. Okay? Okay, so I fixed the problem of the computer. It was basically a projection problem, but this is what I was talking about before, right? That I wanted to show you as a kind of literature introduction to, why the use of specific words matter, right? In case, as literature students, you were not already aware of that. So this is an excerpt from The Call of Cthulhu, right, which is another Lovecraft. This is actually a novel, so it's quite long, but it's not a novel. It's like novella, but anyway, it doesn't matter. So it reads something like this. This is the original. The aperture was black, with a darkness almost material. The tenebrousness was indeed a positive quality, for it obscured such parts of the inner walls as ought to have been revealed, and actually burst forth like smoke from its eon-long imprisonment, visibly darkening the sun as it slunk away into the shrunken and gibbous sky on flapping membranous wings. The odor arising from the newly opened depths was intolerable, and at length the quick-eared Hawkins thought he heard a nasty slopping sound down there. That could be taken in like weird ways, but anyway. Everyone listened, and everyone was listening. Still, when it lumbered slobberingly into sight and gropingly squeezed its gelatinous green immensity through the black doorway into the tainted outside air of that poison madness, that city of madness. So this is just one paragraph, right? And you'll notice that really, as far as action is concerned, all that happens is monster arrives. Right? Like if we wanted to boil it down to two words, that's pretty much what happens, right? And this really good this really good article kind of brought this down. So this whole paragraph here was brought down to these 5.5 lines, right? Without the adverbs and adjectives, or at least the superfluous one. The aperture was black. It obscured parts of the inner wall. It burst forth from its imprisonment, darkening the sky as it slunk away into the sky. Darkening the sun as it slunk away into the sky. An odor arose from its depths, and Hawkins thought he heard a sound down there. Everyone listened, and everyone was listening when it lumbered into sight and squeezed its immensity through the doorway into the outside air of the city. Technically the same thing, right? Like on a purely narrative level, it's ostensibly the same story. But what this exercise is supposed to demonstrate is what Lovecraft is actually doing on the level of language, right? To come back to the idea of vibe, right? He is creating that vibe through the use of adjectives. And so a structuralist reading would examine that specific usage, right? It's not just an aperture that is black. It was black with a darkness that was almost so black that you can touch it, right, is what he's saying. It elevates the sense of what you're talking about and actually adds to the understanding of the story. So I just wanted to give that quick example here, but I won't spend too much time on it, just because we have other things to talk about for today. But, it is something to keep in mind. Okay, so notes on the writing of weird fiction. I don't think it was actually ever a published article by Lovecraft. I think he actually, this was originally from a letter that he sent to a friend of his that was explaining his process of writing these types of stories. And I think it already gets us at what we wanted to discuss today, right, is what makes this type of story, like At the Mountains of Madness, different from its predecessors, right, as far as literary history is concerned. So I'm curious to launch it to you in this case. Is there anything that stood out to you, for those of you who read it and had a time to look at it? Is there anything that stood out to you in this letter/article that you would want to highlight as particularly interesting where it relates to Lovecraft's writing? I have a few passages that I highlighted, but yeah, go ahead, Aya.
Catching out that person that is there and try to explain it as though it's obviously your name. I thought that you said that it was probably a letter in my sense.
It reads like a flex. Kind of. Yeah. Okay. Good. So he seems to have a way with words. You're right. Despite this is something we briefly touched upon, his relatively isolated early life. Right, he's not someone who had a huge contact with the outside world. He was, for all intents and purposes, a rather voracious reader, and so he would have been. I think you're right. Quite gifted with words. But I mean more in the sense of what he's actually saying about weird fiction. What's interesting about his definition or his view of it? Yeah.
He ends by saying that this is why he writes the way he does.
Yes.
And then he explains it. He gives I think
Yeah.
5 order how he's
Yeah, 5 points. Yeah.
And then he says we have to write it in a way of absolute occurrence and then narration and then kind of meld them together, which I find interesting, but it's like a reflection of the way he writes, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There is an interesting contradiction, right, in the article or letter, whatever, right, in this text, where he simultaneously lays out, right, the process, right, what goes into the actual narrative of weird fiction. So there is a narratological element to it. But right at the start, he does mention that it is, at the end of the day, a very, this is right in line 2, by the way, if anyone's following along. He writes these types of stories to visualize more clearly and detailedly the vague, elusive, fragmentary impressions of wonder, beauty, and adventurous expectancy which are conveyed to me by certain sights. Right? So this world around him, to put it in simple terms, is completely baffling. Right? This is something we briefly talked about last week. Right? Incomprehensible world. Right? Everything around us is weird. The fact that a tree can grow to such monstrous proportions from a mini seed, right, that comes from a different tree is this wild phenomenon, right? I'm taking a ridiculous example here, but right, the world around him that he sees is just fragmentary and elusive. And I think these are the 2 key terms that we should hold on to, fragmentary and elusive. And yet he tries to put it in a way that's structured through Storm. But what's interesting is that it never quite feels that way. As we talked about already, right, this type of story never really feels like a regular story. Right? And I think part of what we're going to be able to get at today is why the writing itself makes it feel that way. Right? Because it's technically supposed to structure this weird nonsense world, and yet it makes it more confusing, right, at the end of the day, which I think is kind of the point he's getting at. He does. Does anyone want to read the very last sentence of the first paragraph? I think that's a really interesting one. Yeah, go ahead. No, the one after that. There's a small sentence right after that. Yeah, right. Conflict with time. What do we get from something like that? Yeah. Uh-huh. Okay, good. Say more. Mm-hmm.
I think of writing is to build up more closer to what actually is the pick of the words.
Yeah.
Can elevate the experience of the word.
Good.
So if we're expecting, we know there's a monster.
Yeah.
But we want to see the monster now.
Yeah.
So that it doesn't keep us on edge.
Yeah.
What's the new monster now?
Yeah.
Bring you maybe talk and how I write there is no way somewhere.
So third paragraph. Yeah. As to how I write a story, there is no way.
Everything around us is weird.
Yeah.
So talk about something as why there's no point of writing stories about known things.
Yes.
So it really has been overused, and so that's why he wants to stay in this sort of weird dream state out of this place. That's why he's talking about space.
Yeah. I think that's really good. I think you bring up a really a lot of the points you brought up was good. And just to pick up on that last one of this dream state, he literally points to that, right? In paragraph 3, right? Saying, I have quite literally at times just written down dreams, right? Think of that when we read for next week, right? Psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic literary theory started off in interpreting dreams, right? But how does it, when you think of it, how does a dream feel? Does a dream feel like a normal story with a beginning, middle, and end? Right? For those of you who can remember dreams? No, never does. Right? Anyone who tells me that their dreams have a logical sequence that makes sense to them is lying. Right? I do not believe you. Right? But it's true, right? you're always thrown in the middle of an action, right? When you start a dream, right? You're already falling from a plane, or well, that's a nightmare more than anything. But you're already right at the restaurant with your friends and family, right? There's no in between. You're just thrown into this action, and there's just this vibe that's off, right? People don't speak in the way that they speak. There's details that don't exist in real life, or at least not in the sequences that we're imagining them, right? There's always a vibe behind you that's off. The structure itself, right, of the story in a dreamscape is warped. Right? Does this make sense to everyone? Right? Okay. Sometimes I feel like I'm just this crazy person speaking at the front of class, but that's just the nature of talking about weird fiction. But the other thing you brought up was the excess, right? Just piling stuff on and on and on and on, right? And we'll get to this. This is something that you should all keep in mind, right? And this is something that the example that I gave earlier gets to. He adds all of this extra stuff that technically does not change anything to the action of the story. But the action is not what matters, right? What matters is the telling of the story, right? Not the story itself, right? We talked about this last week. The reason why I'm not talking about the actual events of At the Mountains of Madness is because they're bafflingly simple, right? A couple of guys go into the Arctic to explore some rocks, and they find something else. That's it. That's literally all that happens in that story, is technically, right, that simple. But there's so much excess, right, that makes it undefinable. Okay. Yeah. Just to cap off on this, and then we'll actually talk about At the Mountains of Madness. I'm on the second page here for those of you who are following. I'm looking at the paragraph that starts with each weird story. Each weird story. The fourth paragraph from the end. In the notes of the writing of weird fiction. Sorry, I'm still on the article. Each weird story, to speak more particularly of the horror type, seems to involve 5 definite elements. A, some basic underlying horror. B, the general effects or bearings of the horror. C, the mode of manifestation, right? An object embodying the horror. D, the types of fear reaction pertaining to the horror. And E, the specific effects of the horror in relation to the given set of conditions. Nowhere does he mention the actual story here, right? That's not what he's concerned with. He's not concerned with what I mentioned at the start of Luke Skywalker going through some kind of character transformation. Lovecraft could not care less about character arcs and people going through some kind of story and redemption and fighting the villain and saving their soul or whatever, right? None of that matters. What he's talking about is an underlying horror, keyword here, underlying, the subtext, what's underneath the world around us, right? It's not just a wall. Behind the wall, there's some kind of horror, right? In the asbestos or whatever, right? The asbestos itself would be the horror, but right? Or the general effects of the horror. Right? Often in a Lovecraft story, not in this one necessarily, but in the Call of Cthulhu, that's what happens. The effects of the horror is that people go completely bananas, right? It's not this, they don't care about actually finding Cthulhu. Cthulhu's already there, right? He showed up through the cracks between space and time, right? He arrived and everyone went just crazy. Right, that's how that story ends, by the way. It's like a bit of a spoiler. People just go nuts. Right? So the effects of the horror is what matters here. And yeah, so on and so forth. But the reason why I wanted to highlight that passage is that, again, it's a very structuralist understanding. Right? To come back to the example I gave of the first question here, this is exactly, or even the second question, this is exactly what Todorov and Fry and others, Graymass, what all of these would look at when they're examining a story from a structural perspective, right? Is what makes those stories that specific genre. So obviously, Lovecraft was not necessarily aware of this, right? I don't think he would have put it in the terms that these guys would have put it under. But they're still, I think, very interesting to think about and demonstrates just how pervasive these ideas are in narrative, right? Despite us not necessarily being actively aware of them. Any last thing that we want to mention on notes on the writing of weird fiction before we move on? Okay, good. Like we did last time, this looks very imposing, right? There's a lot of text there. Don't worry. What we did last time, for those who weren't there, is that we're basically putting what I've been talking about for an hour and change, right, into practice. Okay? So I gave you earlier a set of abstract questions, right, that structural readings think about. Now let's try to read Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness through that lens specifically. Okay? So some of the questions that I put up here are things like, what are the signs of the story and what do they signify? So last week we brought up the writings on the cave walls, right, and on the cities and all those designs. Hint, hint, that could be a kind of sign, right, that Lovecraft is putting in. And the characters in the story themselves, or at least the narrator, tries to interpret those signs. Okay? So these are the kinds of questions that you can ask yourselves. Why does that narrator interpret the signs around him in the way that he does? Right? Do you interpret them differently? This can be one way of thinking. What linguistically makes this weird, right? So actually finding examples of the text. So are there things like oppositions in the text? And how do they contribute to its, like Lovecraft said, underlying structure, right? So look for actual evidence in the text of what Lovecraft himself says he puts in the text. Things like what is known versus what is unknown, or what is the distinction between science and myth, right? Or science and religion. What is rational to the characters in the story versus what is considered irrational. These are the kinds of oppositions that we can think about. Right? Or even something like, how does the story conform or subvert the narrative structure of exploration tales, right? So, we briefly mentioned this last week, but I don't think we went into enough depth in it. Narrative tales are kind of where most modern narratives come from, right? We told stories about exploring the planet, right? Marco Polo writing his journals, right, or whatever. Joseph Conrad would do something similar with Heart of Darkness. He would kind of imitate that style, right? So we have certain expectations about what people write about when they're discovering a new place or exploring a new place, right? Is Lovecraft kind of playing with this? Maybe the answer that you'll come up with is no, he's not playing with this and I'm completely reaching, right? That's entirely up to you. But it's something you can think about. And so on and so forth. The last one I might remove it. I might remove what mythological or cultural archetypes. That one's kind of repetitive. So I might remove that one. But what I'd like you to do is take a few minutes, right? And you can get into teams. Like you can get into teams of 2 or 3 and actually talk about it. And actually try to find examples in the text of things like this. Okay? Last week I gave like 15 or 20 minutes. I know you won't have time to answer all of these questions in 15 to 20 minutes. That is more than okay, right? I'm not expecting you to answer every single thing, right? But yeah, start to think about it actively, right? And it's okay if you are not sure. That's why I'm here, and we're going to talk about it afterwards. Okay? Any questions? Okay. Get together, stay alone, do whatever you want, but try to answer some of these questions. In the meantime, I will delete that last question that is a bit redundant. There we go. Yeah, so I'm curious what you all found. Did we have a chance to look at most of the questions? Or at least think about them? Yeah? Okay. So I'll remind you whenever you, or if you give me a passage that you found interesting or that answered any of these questions, just give the page number so that people can follow along, or at least the section that you found it in, so that that would work. So I think we can start with the top one. I think that's probably one of the more straightforward questions that I asked. So, did anyone find any striking or engaging signs, right, as we discussed it in the text? And what did you find them to mean? Or what does the text tell us it means? Yeah, go ahead, Francesca. Say more. The dogs. Yeah.
The dog's behavior, so the barking, it alerts to danger.
Okay. What page are you on, by the way?
Hinge that they become along the story, it kind of foreshadows the arrival of something dangerous, a threat to their group.
Okay, good. So the dogs, right? At the first time that they're mentioned, right? It's mentioned through a letter or through not a letter, but a transmission, right? A telegram that's sent. That they won't necessarily go into a particular spot, right? Good. Let's push this further because I think you're absolutely right. Is the monster or the creature that we're engaging with, is it a human, right? At the end of the day? Just a very simple answer. No, it's anything but human, right? Right. So how can we push this further, right? The dogs don't necessarily want to approach this thing, right? Dogs are generally, right, a domesticated animal, right? They're somewhat close to humans. Yes, Carlos?
Before,
Uh-huh.
I think they start panicking because there was a creature coming towards Denver and the main character. So it says that while the stray penguins in our rear was squawking and screaming and displaying signs of panic, really surprising view. So that's basically the same behavior as the dogs.
Good. Yeah. So, okay. That's really good. I forgot about the penguins somehow. The horrible, grotesque penguins that he describes. Right. So we have on one level, right, earthbound animals, right? The most normal creatures that we have. Literally one of them is man's best friend, so to speak, right, as it's called. And the other one is one of the only inhabitants, right, or living inhabitants of the Antarctic. Mm-hmm. The penguins. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, Shoggoth. Yeah. No, I meant the penguins in this case, but yeah, the Shoggoth as well. And so what we have, right, is the creation of, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. This sign, right, the most natural thing, becoming in a way an opposition or an antagonism to this unnatural creature. Right? I think those are absolutely very valid points, right? But there is still this, I think the penguins is really good because he does relate to them as grotesque and weird, right? So there's this implication, right, that even things on Earth can be bizarre, right? So there's these levels and layers that Lovecraft is adding to the text that, like, dogs are cute and cuddly, right? They don't necessarily want to approach it. But we still have things that, you know, according to at least the narrator, right, is getting close to the grotesqueness of this creature while still being earthbound. So we kind of seem to have levels to it. I don't know if that's what you were thinking of specifically, but that's kind of where my mind went. Did you have anything you wanted to add about that? Or okay, good. Francesco, did you want to add anything? Cool. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Just like to add on like the second question about like what makes this weird.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah. Because there's a passage like page 65 about like during the Jurassic Age, the old world met fresh adversity in the form of a new invasion from outer space. So this time by half fungus, half crustacean creatures from a planet identified as a remote and recently discovered Pluto. Just this specific passage, because we can, because in this case, it says so the creatures are associated as half fungus, half crustacean that are on Earth, and from Pluto, a planet we know exists, and also recently discovered at that point.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But that's really good. Okay, good. recently discovered Pluto is, I think, like, at least that's where my mind went. But also, right, okay, so let's think of this structurally, right? Because Pluto kind of ends with a semicolon, so it's a phrase unto itself, right? We can kind of analyze it on its own. The sentence starts off with the Jurassic Age, right? Millions of years in the past. I don't know when exactly the Jurassic Age is because I'm not an archaeologist and I don't care. But millions of years in the past, right? And yet that sentence fragment ends with the present and a potential projection into the future, right? There's a really interesting thing going on here where, again, we have in the same sentence these things that should not work, right? But I think that's quite perceptive of you. And your raising of the half fungus, half crustacean kind of brings this together. I think, again, if we want to think of this structurally, right in the middle of that sentence, Lovecraft raises the idea of mixing, right? We're crossing over species, we're crossing over literal times in this case, right? Mushrooms are still around, fungus is still around as a thing. And yet crustaceans are these millions of year old creatures that again just kind of still exist in some way, shape, or form today. So I think that's really awesome. Obviously, we haven't quite gone to Pluto yet. I think all we've sent is like a probe up there or anything like that. But right, the implication, right, of these new scientific discoveries juxtaposed with these extremely old creatures is a really strong start to understanding what makes this bizarre, right? And think of it, again, in terms of the time that Lovecraft was living in, right? Imagine being in or living in a world in which we don't even know that all the planets exist, right? Like we've taken this for granted now, right? We've grown up in a time that is so used to the planets that Pluto is no longer a planet, right? That's how used to it we are. We're just like willy-nilly deciding what is a planet and what isn't, right? But Lovecraft, less than 100 years ago when this text was written, was still at a time in which this was on the horizon of possibilities, right? We were still projecting human eyes, right, through telescopes and all that stuff, right, into the great cosmos. We literally had no idea the extent of our own solar system, right? And now, of course, we're launching into probably other solar systems. I don't follow what NASA's doing or anything like that, but we're going way beyond Pluto, right, with all kinds of probes. And that's really what he's getting at, right? At the end of the day, he's, concerned. I don't think he's necessarily saying it's a bad thing, right? But he is operating within this world where wondering what's out there is an increasing, thing on people's minds, right? And that's inherently bizarre because you literally do not know, right? Now we know that it's pretty much nothing. Most of it is made up of like negative space or whatever, which is kind of terrifying in and of itself, right? Ending up in space and it being quite literally nothing. That's the whole point of the movie Gravity, which was otherwise a terrible movie with a pretty good premise. But, the idea, right, that it's nothingness out there is pretty fascinating, I would say. Good. Anything else that people brought up or highlighted, either for the first questions or any other question? Yeah, go ahead, Adam.
For question 4 and 3 and 4.
Okay, yeah.
It's at the page 76, 77. Yeah. 76, second paragraph, the final 2 sentences.
This is in section 8, yeah? Pretty sure. Anyway, go on.
Yeah. Section 9.
Okay, good.
76.
Okay, yep.
Let me try to state that thing without flinching. There was an odor, and that odor was vaguely, subtly, and unmistakably akin to what had nauseated us upon opening the insane grave that horrible lake had dissected. And after that, in the I think second paragraph in page 77, it continues this. It was during that pause that we caught simultaneously this time the other odor ahead. Paradoxically, it was both a less frightful and a more frightful odor. Less frightful, all intrinsically sickly, but infinitely appalling if displaced under unknown circumstances, unless of course giddy. For the older was the plain and familiar one of common petrol, everyday gasoline.
Good. Why did that one strike out to you for those questions?
So binary oppositions,
Mhm.
like paradoxically or like immediately, like it's both less frightful and more frightful.
Uh-huh.
Less frightful because it's a familiar scent they're very accustomed to, but it's more frightful because it shouldn't be here, like
Yes.
in any circumstance. Yeah. While for the let me start off from this. Yeah, like in this case, it's actually it would be even more fitting in the second question than for question, I think.
Okay, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
the binary opposition is kind of there, right? With the known and unknown, and you can even think of it in along the lines of like again time, which he brought up, right? Time out of joint. In his notes on weird fiction, he kind of brings this up, where who knows here how petrol is made? Like when we drill, right? That black stuff that comes out of the ground. How is that created? How did it end up there? Do we know? Yeah. Yeah, it's fossils that have basically decomposed into black mush, right? That's for millions of years, right? So again, think of it along the lines of the Jurassic, right? I actually don't know if Lovecraft knew, like if we knew that it was just dinosaurs that had decomposed. I don't know when that was discovered, but we can think of it that way because it's really cool. So this idea, right, that this creature, a literal dinosaur in this case, died millions of years ago, decomposed and ended up as black sludge that powers our cars, which is weird in and of itself. So it's something that is specifically related to time, right? There's a temporal element to the fact that it was able to be there at all, right? Is juxtaposed, right, with a few lines earlier, with the idea of infinitely appalling, right? This infinity that presumably, by definition, can go on forever, right? And yet something like gasoline, we know now, just can't, right? There's a limited supply. Not only were there a limited amount of fossils, right? There weren't infinite dinosaurs, but also gasoline as a commodity and as a thing, right, arrives in limited resources. And yet, right, not only that, if we want to push this even further, it's infinity juxtaposed with gasoline that's in this frozen space, right? The Antarctic, right? The Antarctic, is ice, obviously, right? This thing that we imagine as solid, immovable, right? Which I think is really, really interesting to juxtapose here. You can even push it further, right? I think this is going beyond the structural reading, but I just thought of this and I wanted to share it with you because I thought it's cool. Now the Antarctic is changing, right? It's for the first time in centuries, right, that the actual Antarctic as we know it is doing what exactly? What's happening to the Antarctic? Yeah, good. It's melting. No, not good, but yes, it's melting, right? Right? It's literally collapsing, right? Why? Climate change, global warming, right? So this thing, right, that we imagine as this literally frozen in time and space is collapsing in on itself, right? In part because of things like gasoline, right, and petrol, which again, people were broadly aware of ideas of the climate changing, right? But they weren't necessarily aware of it on the level that we are today. So I don't know to what extent Lovecraft would have deliberately put this into his text. I don't think it's fair to assume that. But again, I think it is very interesting for us to think about these levels of the text, right, into the modern era. Good. Awesome. Thank you very much for that. Yeah.
One more.
Yeah, please go ahead.
For the last question, like all the tequila stuff.
Okay, yeah.
It's not basically free and after. Where just this one sound, right? Poe may have had access when writing as Arthur Gordon Pym a century ago. We remember that in that fantastic tale there is a world of unknown, but terrible and prodigious is insignificance connected with Antarctic, and screened eternally by a gigantic, spectrally snowy bird of the Melon region's core. The Kalili.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. This passage just because it is repeated multiple times, and also the fact that it was originally appeared in Edgar Allan Poe's like works,
Yeah.
and specifically in the Antarctic, which is where they are. It happens that that sound is there.
Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting. I'm just trying to find the passage here.
Page 93, the second half of the first paragraph.
Right. Okay. But yeah, it appears like throughout the actual text, right? Tigalili, Tigalili. And not only does it happen in the Arctic, that Poe story, right? If we want to think about it in the terms that we laid out for today, right? It's Poe acknowledging, right, his own influences in many ways. He knows he's read Poe, right? And we talked about it last week. He references painters and so on. But on a textual level, right, he's acknowledging his own influences and expanding on it, right? He's saying, great. He's expanding on it in a way that I think gets to the heart of what weird fiction is, where he's making Poe a real writer in Lovecraft's, canon, right, into a fictional character or some fictionalized version of Poe in the story itself, right? So Poe becomes a part of the structure of the very text that we're reading, right? And it's allowing Lovecraft to expand his own world and imagine this bizarre situation in which Poe might have had access to these otherworldly creatures, right? Poe is some kind of mystic in this universe. Right? I say Lovecraft says this. The narrator of the story says this. Good, very awesome. Someone other than Adam. What else did we identify as passages? Right? Your answers are really good. I'm just curious, like what other people came up with. I'm liking this exercise. It's fun. Yeah, go ahead, Minley. Okay. Yep. What recurring motifs?
But for chapters around chapter 6.
Chapter 6, yeah.
They explored the building.
Mm-hmm.
And they describes the building very in depth of how gigantic it is.
Yeah.
And how well built it is to an extent that's
Mm-hmm. Do you have a specific passage in mind?
well, the whole chapter is real details.
Good. Yeah, I'm just going to it now. Yeah, okay. Did anyone notice, by the way? This is really good. So the building, right? This thing that, again, logically speaking, we all know what a building is. Okay? Think of this in terms that we were talking about before the break. Sign and signifier. If I say building, you all, I'm sure, have some kind of image in mind, right? Probably a contemporary building, something either gray with windows in it, or just all windows all the way up, right? That's probably what you're imagining. Maybe some kind of suburban household, right? If I had to guess, that would probably be one of the three things that comes to your mind, right? And so he's playing on that, right? Using the term building, and yet saying, but basically don't think of the building you're thinking of, right? That's essentially what he's doing in this chapter, okay? And that's why it takes, like you were saying, Minley, almost an entire chapter for him to describe what is quite literally indescribable, right? Because he has to go through this and really lay it on as to why this is not what you think it is. He's playing with your internal structure, your internal suppositions, your linguistic suppositions. Which again, right, we might find confusing, but that's kind of the point, right? Language is something that we are all familiar with, right? And language doesn't change overnight, but language is something that we use every day, and so we are comfortable with our knowledge of our own language. If you want a really good example of this, just use, right, one of the jargon terms that your generation tends to use on the internet with your parents. Right? They'll be completely confused, right? Sometimes I'm confused with myself when I say them, right? But this is just like an easy example of how language is this really fickle thing that we rely on, right? We rely on our own expectations of what it is. And so even a simple word like building, right, which we all have expectations for, is warped here. It's monstrous. It's gigantic. Or as he says right at the beginning of chapter 6, the rooms we encountered were all of imaginable shapes and proportions, ranging from 5-point stars to triangles and perfect cubes. Right? This is a really good example, right? All of these things are things that we can imagine. I'm sure you can all imagine a triangle, right? A circle. You all went to elementary school, so you all know what a triangle and a circle and a square is. But try imagining a room with all of those things just kind of plopped together in a weird, nonsense order that is unlike anything that we've seen before. It would look like Habitat was on set or something like that, which, if you don't know what I'm talking about, look it up on Google afterwards, right? It's just weird building that exists, doesn't matter, in Montreal. They made it in 1967 for the centenary. But actually, I can look it up here. Yeah, this. If ever you've never been to this part of Montreal, it's worth a look. This is technically a building that exists in Montreal. Right? Like, imagine this inside is basically what he's describing, right? He's kind of describing the whole city built like this, with buildings and interior scapes that make no logical sense. Can you imagine, right? Not even like 60 years ago, people were like, yes, this is going to be the future of architecture, is this monstrosity of a thing.
A lot of movies, like sci-fi movies, even like trying to depict like the houses to be sort of like more organized, but sort of like this.
Yeah, it does show like what people thought the future was going to be like. And of course, now each of these goes for like $1 million each if you want to buy a place inside the actual Habitat was on set, which people live in there, but it's only, Jeff Bezos or whatever. So that's great. Really fun. Also, it's like right outside of Montreal. It sucks, but like, anyway. Yeah, good. So, where were we? Yes, the buildings. What else did we come up with? What other passages struck out to us? Yeah.
To talk about the first question.
Yeah.
Story which indicates the power of scientific readiness using the scientific curiosity. For example, page 95.
Yeah.
Here it is very dangerous situation. But as it saw in the previous paragraph, in the midst of our life, with our faculty set on the program escape, we are in the condition to observe and analyze details. Even so, our latent brain cells will still wonder at the message brought them by our notaries. I think this indicates, however, it is horrible and terrible. It cannot stop the passion of scientific. I feel in this.
Yeah. I really like that bit at the end, right? It's horrible and terrible, and yet, right, the curiosity kind of gets the best of them in some ways, right? It does get at the heart, I think, of the structuralist project in and of itself, right? It's born out of a kind of horror, right? Of wanting to try to find the structure of something behind the thing. And we hope that finding that structure will make it make sense, right? In many ways, which is the hubris of science, to Lovecraft at least, right? That's in his mind, that's the foolhardy task, right? Is that scientists will use what they have at their disposal to try to understand what they're encountering, and yet, by definition, they will fail, right? You can't understand it because we're dealing with beings that are millions of years old. They do not respect your rules. They aren't even aware of the rules that you're trying to play the game with, right? Very good. Very good. I just thought of this, but just to come back real quick to chapter 6 before I forget, where is, yeah, kind of. No, not chapter 6. Sorry. I said chapter 6, but not quite. I had it in my notes somewhere. Sorry. Yeah, chapter 11, chapter 12, right? Oh no. Okay, sorry. These are my notes that I'm trying to. Yeah, sorry. No, I was right. Chapter 6. Who can tell me chapter 6, right? The building thing. why it might matter as a whole from a structural perspective, in the literal sense of the structure of a story. Why might it matter?
Can you repeat that?
So, chapter 6, right? It exists. It's the description of buildings. Why might it matter from a structural perspective? Like literally. Yeah.
Because they kind of like would like anticipate how big the monster would be.
Okay, good. So it does anticipate that. So it refers to like the gigantic nature of things, right? It lets your imagination kind of get at that. Let's push that further. Yes.
Gravity of the unknown.
So we,
Bigger and then faster than what we.
right? So it's Lovecraft getting at, think more structurally, literally in the narrative structure here. But all of these are related. Why does it happen in chapter 6 though? Yes.
I think as things start normal, they find like if you start about like when they find the city compared to when like the story started.
Yeah.
They initially went in to find something else, something weird,
Yes.
discover more.
Yes.
And then afterward, like it was normal until they actually went inside. And there was no lake, and his crew went in and like found there were actually corpses, right? I don't remember.
But no, there were like he imagines, or at least he defines corpses. There's the dog corpses. There's other people.
The monster, the creature.
Yeah, the creatures. It's unclear whether it's actual like carvings or fossils themselves, right? Again, this fits in with like the expectations of them reading the world type of thing. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But like, and then after they enter the actual building, they're
Yes.
seeing like all this like symbols and church and all that.
Yeah.
And the more they explore the creatures' bodies while dissecting, and the more they explore the houses and like look at the structure of it, the weirder it gets of how different, even then a bit similar they are to what like we know. Like I think they mentioned that the creatures had like a sort of like plant-based bodies. So I wasn't sure if they were actually like actual plant creatures, or like meat-based creatures.
Yeah.
Something like this.
I'll stop you right there.
Yeah.
Really good. That's not the question I'm asking though.
Fair enough.
You're all getting at really good points, and they all relate to chapter 6. Yes. Chapter 6. Okay. You're all correct. Getting at the building, getting at the weird elements, getting at the actual changes, right, that are happening in the story, right? It starts off normal and then shifts. Why does it happen in chapter 6? Think of this on a structural level. Yes, thank you. It's halfway through the story, right? Good. I was wondering how, so there are 12 chapters to this story, right? Chapter 6 is literally the middle of the story here, right? If we want to think of it, again, very bad, right? Good. You might have seen this before, right? How story structure works, right? Some of you might have seen this.
Rising action, and so on. Yeah. This is chapter 6,
Right? The literal middle point, right? But it's not just the middle point.
No,
Whatever happens, right, after this point, nothing can ever be the same again, right? No matter what the characters experience, right, you can't go back to normal. Right? And this is not exclusive to Lovecraft, right? Again, this is story structure, as a lot of people understand it. I gave the example of Star Wars earlier. Literally, this happens in Star Wars, right? I forget what the middle point is. I think, if I remember correctly, the middle point of that first movie is the Death Star actually like blowing up Alderaan or something like that. Right, that's kind of like where things fully shift, right, into the point of no return for the rebels, right? I'm misremembering maybe Star Wars, but you get the point, right? There's usually something in a story that happens where the characters can no longer go back home, right? Now, chapter 6 is that middle point for the characters in the story, but also for us as readers, right? No matter what we read afterwards, right, suddenly we have to think on a completely different register. Right? You are no longer thinking of the world around you. Right? You are thinking of this impossible. And that's what happens with chapter 6. Right? You shift over, right, into the impossible. And no matter how many metaphors you use, to come back to your question, to your answer, Adam, which was good, but not what I was looking for. But, to come back to that answer that you gave when we said, oh, you don't know if the monsters are vegetable or meat-based or whatever, right? It doesn't matter, right? No matter what you describe it as, it's not going to work because it has nothing to do with earth-based, biology, right? So all of these metaphors that the narrator is trying to create in his mind are him trying to get back to that original state, right? Before he encountered this impossible thing, right? And yet it always fails. And as a story, it has to fail because otherwise it wouldn't be, narratively satisfying or it wouldn't be weird fiction, right? Did I say something funny, Milezi? In a good way? Oh, okay, yeah. Well, I'm almost finished. I think we'll call it pretty soon. I just have a few I just have a few questions that I want to finish off, unless anyone wants to say anything off of that, right? But I think the reason why I'm saying like we'll kind of end it and go into something else, right, is because I think this really gets us to the core question that I asked at the start of today's class, right? What makes this weird fiction, right? So by 1931, when At the Mountains of Madness came out, weird fiction, this was not Lovecraft's first story. He had been writing stories for about 15 years at this point. So the idea of weird fiction had been established for a bit, right? Which is what allowed him to write something like Notes on the Writing of Weird Fiction. So yeah, I guess I kind of answered part of it here. But, sorry. What makes this weird fiction, right? Let's bring everything that we talked about today in class together, right? Yeah.
It's impossible to describe.
Good. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's impossible to describe in a way that it's both familiar, but also like structurally so different.
Yeah.
Like at the base, it's so different and unknown. We can't, no matter like how like, you were just saying this about how like we can't associate anything truly with it.
Good.
It's too far out there.
Yeah, absolutely. So not only is it too far out there, right? So he's using the basis of narrative structure, right? Beginning, middle, and end, all of that is there, right? But already think of this from what we expect. Where does the character and the main character end up at the end? Does he end up in a narratively satisfying conclusion? No, right? He literally does not return home yet, right? In this case, he literally ends the story and he hasn't yet returned, right? If I remember correctly, I read it before, but like the story, right, ends and he's still talking about, when we get home or whatever like that. It's left open-ended, right? There isn't that satisfaction that we get from a narrative perspective of the protagonist going back home and everything is okay, right? Yes. Good. Right. So by the very nature of him writing the story, there is the implication that he must go back home in some way, shape, or form, right? But is he the same, right? No. How? And again, think of it, try to put yourselves in his shoes, right? In the narrator's shoes. You go somewhere and you realize that literally the entire universe as you know it is not at all the same, right? Like literally every single aspect of the world is wrong, right? The way that the world was created, right, is wrong, right? What's out there in the great cosmos is wrong. It's not nothingness. It's filled with cosmic beings that, consider you an ant under their feet, right? It's terrifying, right? So you can't go back home normally after that, right? So yeah, like technically he does, like it's implied that he goes back home, right? Emotionally, not necessarily, right? And again, on a story level, we don't get that satisfaction of him going back home, seeing his wife and kids or whatever like that, and then happily ever after, right? Which even, a story, just to take the more conventional example again, right? The story of Star Wars ends on that, right? That's what a conventional narrative does. It ends and they all get a medal and everyone's happy, right? That's how that movie ends, right? Not this. We don't know. We don't know what he's going to do with that information, right? Maybe he's going to tell it to people and people are going to laugh in his face, right? Maybe he's going to keep it to himself, right? Never publishes what we read and go crazy with the knowledge of what he has, right? We don't know. Maybe everything goes well and the world is changed forever. It doesn't matter. We don't know. Yes, Adam, you had your hand up.
Yeah. Just a point to bring up from
Please.
from last week's readings, the extra readings. I had read a bit from them. They were very interesting. And I forgot which one it was, but at one point there was this point made that the thing that makes Lovecraft so weird, terrifying, and all that.
Yeah.
It brings up the idea that humans normally now we usually think that we're the masters of our universe, of our world.
Yeah.
But Lovecraft brings in this idea that we're not.
Yeah.
Everything we thought we were in control of actually wasn't.
Good. Yes.
And I really like this interpretation of it.
Yeah, exactly. So again, this comes back to our main reading pattern for today. What's the structure of the world, right? Freud would say it's all in your mind, right? Marx would say it's the capitalists, right? Saussure would say it's language. Lovecraft says there ain't no structure, baby. Right? It's all just creatures going around fucking with humans, right? And it's a terrifying thought, right? To suddenly realize that there ain't nothing out there, right? And it's all just chaos, right? Is terrifying. Right? And by the way, right, there's a lot of interesting research. This has nothing to do with Lovecraft, but kind of does. There's a lot of interesting research being done on that's one of the reasons why conspiracy theories become a thing, right? Is because people actually try to look for meaning in things that sometimes are just random, right? To take the lizard person, right? Conspiracy theory that the government is all just lizard people or whatever. In a world in which constantly our states fail us, right? For a variety of reasons, right? They're overthrown by people, they're corrupt, they're whatever, right? The list goes on and on and on, right? Thinking that the reason why, right, that all of these bad things happen is because there's something behind all of this. Whether, obviously it's not true, there are no lizard people. But for people who want to believe that, right, it's a very reassuring thought. It gives you something to actually go up against, right? I'm making a bit of a joke about it with conspiracy theories and things like that, but that's kind of the logic behind it, right? And you don't even need to take some wild conspiracy theory. Just the classic one of the JFK assassination, right? There's been a bunch of conspiracy theories about that, right? And a lot of them come down to it was an institutional setup, right? Oh, it was the CIA or whatever, right? It was the American government that thought he was, too much of a liberal or whatever. And so, it always comes back to finding the meaning behind something else, right? That was just a parenthesis on my end because I think that's just interesting. Okay, but to come back, right, I think we're absolutely getting onto something here of what makes this weird. Mm-hmm. And think back to the Poe story, right, and the Gilman story. When we talked about those, you all pretty much firmly established, yes, this is a weird tale, right? And I push back a bit against that, saying I think it has weird aspects, but it wouldn't necessarily qualify as a weird story in and of itself, right? And I'm curious if you've changed your minds a little bit on that, right? It's okay if not, but for me, the way the Poe story ends, for example, technically the rest of the world is normal, right? Nothing else about the rest of planet Earth has changed, right? At the end of that Poe story. The house is destroyed and things are technically back to normal, right? As far as the narrator's concerned. Yeah, Ben, go ahead.
I would say you were honestly closer to what we were saying. It has weird elements, but it's not I changed my opinion because I was of the opinion that it was a weird story, but I don't really think it is.
Okay.
It's a weird tale rather than a weird story.
Good.
In a way that it's more focused in its own bubble of the world, like in its own bubble, like a part of the world, rather than like encompassing like comprehension of things.
Yeah.
In a way that Lovecraft did it.
I think that term, right, the bubbling off, right, it's over there. You don't have to worry about it because it's in its own bubble, right? And that bubble's going to pop by the end of the story, but it has no impact. It has no ripple effect on everything else. It's just a story over there. Lovecraft goes beyond that and says, no, there is no bubble. It's all involved. Yeah. So I think even starting next week, we'll start to mitigate that a bit, right? What we consider the world, right, can vary very much from one author to another, right? Lovecraft is very much taking that position that it's the entire planet or the entire cosmos that's bizarre, right? And that's where really that shift happens. But I think other authors are going to take a different aspect to it and qualify it as it's the narrator's world itself, right? However that's defined, that shifts, right? Which can mean either the narrator's community, right, or the protagonist's community, right? It can mean the protagonist's vision of the world can change, right? But it doesn't necessarily have to be cosmic, right? So keep that in mind. I think that's a really good question, right? Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Just because the house disappeared, it was normal.
Yeah.
So in this tale, only the house was the weird element or aspect.
I would say that. You don't have to agree with me, but I would say that. Yeah. Yeah.
The house elements
Mhm.
and this and the whole story.
Yeah.
And Mountain of
Madness.
Madness,
Yeah.
only this rooted in a state
Yeah.
civilization
Uh-huh.
was the weird element of
It's a weird element, but it has the difference is that at the Mountains of Madness, the weird elements has repercussions on everything, right? So think of it in this way, right? In the narrator and the main character in House of Usher only describes the house and its contents, right, as bizarre. Before that, everything else seemed normal, and then he arrived at the house, and everything was changed. Everything about that specific thing was bizarre. And then when the house collapsed, things seemed to be fine again, right? But in this, right, and at the Mountains of Madness, the penguins are bizarre, right? The mountains themselves cause madness, literally, right? You go crazy with everything that's around it, right? And at the center of it, chapter 6, you get, at the literal center of this madness, you get the weird alien creatures, right? From which everything kind of emanates out, right? So in a way, you can almost think of it, right? Instead of thinking of it like a up and down, right? This story, in a sense, works more like a wave, right? They're getting closer and closer and closer into the middle, and then going back out, 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 out. This was all off the cuff, right? I don't know if these were not notes that I had planned, but I liked where you were going, so I decided to go into that direction. But cool. Okay. As we go forward in the semester, we're going to stop actually thinking through what the definition, well, not necessarily stop, but I'm going to operate under the idea that this is kind of like my baseline for weird fiction, right? There's going to be some things that kind of modify this. And you can actually, that would be a good essay topic, by the way, what counts as weird or not, or if any of the stories kind of subvert our expectations of this unexpected form. Right? Anyway, just a thought. Before I let you go, does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Just about the midterm.
Yes.
I don't know, is it gonna be about one of the we should one the books or about the
Okay, so the midterm is week 6, yeah? Week 7? In 3 weeks? Yeah, okay. I was going to tell you this probably closer to the midterm, but yeah, I might as well say it now. There's going to be a few short questions that I'll be asking you, right? I've already started writing it, but all of the things that we've been talking about, it's not just me rambling, right? Some of the questions I've asked in class might come up again. Some of the questions that I've asked in class might come up again. Some of the questions in class might come up again. Okay? Hint. Okay? So think about that, perhaps. Yes?
Is it open book exam?
Yeah, open book. It's fine. I don't care. your ability to pass the exam is not contingent on whether or not you can remember every single detail. And I'm not going to be asking questions like, what is this passage from? Right? Or things like that. I'm not going to ask you passage identification. I'm actually asking you to think about the texts. Okay? So there's going to be some more abstract questions, right? And there's going to be questions that I'm going to be asking you that relate to some of the more theoretical aspects, right? So if you do not understand these things, right, don't hesitate to ask, right? But the bulk of the exam, I don't mind telling you, but I'm not going to tell you what the specific questions are. But I'm basically going to pick and choose some of the questions that I've given you in slides like this, right? So I'm going to have like 5 or 6 theoretical questions for you to choose from. And I'm going to have the texts that we've talked about in class so far on another hand. And I'm going to ask you to apply one of those questions to one of those texts. I'll let you decide kind of which one you go into, right? Which is why it's open book. But yeah, that's pretty much what I'm thinking of for the midterm, right? I haven't finished the actual writing of the midterm, but that's pretty much where I'm going with it, okay? So if you've read the texts, and if you have some understanding of the basic theoretical questions that we've gone through, you'll be fine for the midterm, okay? And don't worry about the length of the actual answers that you're going to have to write. It's not like a full essay that I'm going to ask you to write. It's going to be something like 500 words or something like that. Something straight to the point, kind of unpack a passage that, yeah, all 3 hours, no problem, right? Take the time to think about it, properly address a question, okay? Does that make sense to everyone? Does anyone have any other questions? I'll be repeating this probably as I get a better sense of what the actual midterm is going to be. But before you pack up, as always, there's some suggested readings if you want more about structuralist analysis. Just a sec. And next week, we are talking about 2 short stories, right? The one is a translation of a Japanese short story called The Hell Screen. I'm using a translation from 1948 because that's the one I had. If I remember correctly, I put up the same translation online. We'll get the same story. If you decide to go with a different translation, that's on you. But just use the one that's on Studium and you'll be fine. And the other one is a Kafka story, which you might have heard, or you might have read, called In the Penal Colony. The theoretical text, Mark Fisher's The Weird and the Eerie, I think is really good. I only put an excerpt up on Studium because it's a whole book, and I don't expect you to read a whole theoretical book. But it's really good. I think Mark Fisher is shockingly clear in his writing, and it's unfortunate that he's no longer with us, but I'm hoping to I ordered a copy of his book physically so to have it in class with me, but I don't think I'll get it in time. But yeah, so I recommend that you read it, but at the very least, read the 2 short stories for next week. Okay? Yes, you had a question.
For reviews.
Yeah.
But if I have them now, do you collect them now and give us feedback now, or are we going to collect them all at the end of the semester?
No, I'm not going to collect them. Yeah, that's because some of you have already started to send me your reviews, so I'll answer that to the wider class. Sue's question was, do I get to them immediately? Well, more or less immediately. I haven't gotten to the ones that were sent already, but I will be getting to them probably this weekend. So yeah, I do correct them as they come in, right? You don't have to wait till the end of the semester to get feedback.
Is it for next week?
No, it's for whenever. Yeah.
Oh, well, okay.
Okay, that's good to know, because what if my first one's really shit, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But, have a nice weekend, everyone.
And you want us to email it too, right?
Email, or if you want to print it out and give it to me, that's entirely up to you.
Favorite.